Greetings. Welcome to the DragonCon Urban Fantasy Track, part of DragonCon Goes Virtual 2020. We're here tonight to discuss vampires, and we certainly are glad that you're joining us. Our official title is Undead Devotion, and we'll see if that enduring appeal will in fact be the case amongst the vampires we talk tonight. I'm going to have each one of my wonderful panelists introduce themselves, and we'll begin with Tina.
Hi, I'm Tina Glasneck, and I'm a USA Today bestselling author. I'm most well known for my Order of the Dragon and Hell Chronicle series.
Thank you. Clay.
I am Clay Griffith, half of the Clay and Susan Griffith writing team. We're probably best known for the Vampire Empire Quartet that we wrote, and also for the Tick comic books.
Thank you. Jeremy.
I'm J.F. Lewis. The J stands for Jeremy, the F stands for something else, and I write books that get me into trouble. The Vampire Winds of the Void City series, but I also wrote the Grudgebearer trilogy, which is epic fantasy.
Thank you. Michael.
Michael G. Williams. My vampire series was the Withrow Chronicles, a 5-book urban fantasy and vampire series where I took vampires and other genres and mashed it up with a different genre in each book. And that concluded last year, and a boxed set will be available right before DragonCon Goes Virtual. So by the time you're watching this, they're all collected.
Oh, wow. Okay. And Rachel.
Hi, I'm R.E. Carr. The R stands for Rachel. The E stands for Elaine, which is much more boring than something else. I have the distinction of writing not one, but 2 series with vampires from both sides of it. My Rules Undying series was Kindle Scout Selection, started in 2015, and it is complete. You can also check out False Icons, which I wrote with Rick Walteri of Bill the Vampire fame. It's a lot of vampires.
Yes, it is. It's a lot of vampires. Well, now, my first question for all of you is, why do you think that vampires have the appeal they do, and what was their special appeal for you in particular? And Tina, we'll start with you.
Well, I think one part that's very special about the vampire is that it gets over this fear of death. It makes death something to look forward to, where you don't have to be afraid of whether there's a heaven or a hell. There's the idea of becoming this more than you could possibly be as a human. You have supposedly superpowers, super strength. You might become exceedingly wealthy, depending on what type of vampire you become. You become sexy, and just all these great appealing things. So we've gone away from the idea of blood and drinking blood to something a lot more glamorous and sparkling.
Okay, Rachel just can't wait. Clay.
For me, the appeal as a writer anyway is sort of the flexibility of vampires. They can be anything you need them to be. They can be animalistic creatures, just pure monsters, and they can be playboys. The dude with the good suit or the woman with the nice dress or fast car. They can be rich, they can be anything, but they're still predators and they're still dangerous. So even when they're shiny and nice, there's that undertone of danger that is what drama is all about. So as a writer, they're perfect.
Yeah, that dichotomy there gives you both sides to play with.
Oh, yeah.
Jeremy.
Yeah, I think it definitely ties into the whole, sex, blood, death. Humans are kind of obsessed with all those things. And, that sums up vampires. So, and yeah, you can definitely, they're kind of a Rorschach test for a writer, because you can hang whatever plot or story you want to on vampires.
Okay. Michael.
So when I was a first-year student in college, some number of decades ago, more than a couple, but fewer than many, I had a friend who said, "You, Michael Williams, need to read Interview with the Vampire. I'd never heard of it, but I was a little 18-year-old freshman from way up the mountain in Western North Carolina. And somebody said, you need to read this book. I think you'll really connect with it. And for me, it was this huge queer narrative. It was this great metaphor for being outside of like the heterosexual cisgender mainstream, where there are these characters who ultimately just kind of want to get on with their lives, but the world around them is convinced that they're dangerous, and so convinced that it has made them dangerous, and so they have just had to lean in on that. So that was something that I did really connect with, and that was like my first moment of thinking, oh, that's why I like this genre as a reader. I had read Dracula in like junior high, and it had become my favorite novel, but I never really understood what it was that I loved about it. As a writer, I love vampires because they're so weird. There's so much potential there for them to run counter to the common narrative of what a vampire should be. Ultimately, vampires are like super senior citizens who also are trapped in the body of a 17 to 25-year-old, and they never have to leave the party, but they'll never understand the music. And that's really fascinating to me.
Great. Okay, Rachel.
Oh, I took the weird. I went straight dove off into the weird deep end. I was a goth in the 90s, therefore Interview with a Vampire was a very important part of my life, like all goths in the 90s. But I too had it that they were outsiders, but I, for many years, had a complicated relationship with vampires because I thought they were silly. I didn't think there was any other stories to tell about them. I had to read Twilight for my daughter, and I'm not knocking it because I know that's a popular thing to do, but it was not my bag. And I will be perfectly honest about it. And after an epic 3-day diatribe about all the things that I was upset about, my friends dared me, well, you do it better then. I don't know if I necessarily did it better, but I sure as heck did it weirder. And I forgot the memo that vampires were supposed to be sexy, apparently, or competent. But I love the fact that they are basically senior citizens with baby faces. And I have way too much fun mocking the, why are you dating high school girl, like, trope.
Ah, okay. Well, and that's a nice variety that that all of you have spoken about. And now we're going to get to hear about even more specific variety. Can you tell our viewers a bit about the mythos, your vampire mythos, and that you work with either in one series, or if you have more than one, you can tell us both. And then, also give us an idea of what some of if they have some kind of unique strengths or weaknesses, what those would be. And let's see, I'm going to start with you, Clay, this time.
Okay. In our Vampire Empire series, what we decided to do was take the mythology of the vampire, but give it a biological explanation. Our vampires are not undead. They are not created. They're born. They are a parasitic species which has co-evolved with humans from the beginning of time. They have unique abilities, but we had to come up with biological reasons to explain why, for instance, in the mythology, you had to drive a stake through their heart or decapitate them to kill them. In our world, our vampires, for instance, have very poor sense of touch. They don't feel anything. So if you shoot them or stab them in general, they don't suffer shock. They're wounded, but they don't go into shock. So it's hard to stop them. But if you destroy a major organ like their heart or their head, they'll die. We also had to go through a lot of the other explanations and try to come up with reasons. Some, like they don't turn into mist or bats or any of that stuff. That's just not feasible. But we wanted to give a reasonable explanation why these biological creatures, and they do live a long time, they live 800-900 years typically, although they tend to succumb to Alzheimer's type symptoms as they get older. So that was kind of the fun. We could still have vampires. They're monstrous creatures, and some of them were well dressed and pleasant. Others were just animals that lived in sewers and fed. So it allowed us a huge range, and it allowed us to pick and choose from the mythos as long as we could come up with a reasonable explanation why humanity would have, or how humanity would have explained that over the centuries.
Okay. Jeremy.
Yeah, I think since my vampire approach was kind of a reaction to what I didn't like, it's like, okay, they're all the bloodline things, and maybe it's because I have a mild issue with authority. I don't know. I decided, no, it's not bloodline. It's kind of like the ultimate personality test. So the more interesting an individual you are, then the more powerful a vampire you'll be, and the more different you'll be from other vampires around you, because the kind of vampire you are is kind of built on what you expect to be. So you have, I guess that shows up the most in one of the characters, Greta, who is my main character's daughter, who she's the only vampire that we meet in the book that really gets what a vampire is, that they're not the body is an interface. The vampire is the mystical energy field that's making it move around, and that's why you can turn into bats and stuff. But the fun thing that I like to play with is the idea that, at least for her, the reason she's hungry all the time, slight spoiler, is you have to feed your largest form. And she wondered if something was possible, found out it was, and it's very big and it requires a lot of blood. So, but the thing is, I think that when playing with vampires, that was the fun part for me, was to find out, well, okay, I want to do this wild, zany thing, but it also has to fit within the rules. And so then what happens? Why do we have some of these vampires who can be killed easily? And it's like, oh, well, because those aren't very unimaginative people. So they became a vampire, just like the old wives' tales, and, stake through the heart can wipe them out.
Okay, thank you. Michael.
Mine are magical. They are created by their creator. There's an arcane ritual involved, and it's pretty, bog standard, like drain them of their blood, give them some of yours, say the right words. If they want to come back, they'll come back, etc. But that is a pretty closely guarded secret, how to do that. The vampires in my world, in the world of the Withrow Chronicles, operate more or less like a mafia family, but it's like one mafia family that runs the business everywhere. And the really old vampires really liked the idea of like being the only vampire within sight and living in the castle on the hill. And every once in a while, the villagers would bring you a maiden, and it's dinner time. And eventually the Industrial Revolution happened, and all of their kids got really tired of being basically slaves to them, and so overthrew them and said, huzzah, we're going to live in the modern world. And then the modern world kept changing even more rapidly, and they weren't really that interested in being a part of it. So that basically by the end of the late 20th century, the only vampires that are really around and active are pretty new vampires. They're people who understand things like cars and space flight and things like that, because they're not like shocked into being incapable of operating by it. But in terms of how they function, that's magic, and they know it's magic, but very few of them understand how that magic works. In the same way that very few people are microbiologists who could explain in detail the function of the human body at a cellular level. They know that it's possible to make more vampires, and some of them know how to do it, much like people and biology, but again, they aren't like that great at predicting the outcomes. And all of this adds up to them being in a very vulnerable position and feeling very threatened by the possibility that other vampires will make more vampires than they do. So, there's the old saying of two people may keep a secret if one of them is dead. Generally speaking, vampires don't socialize with other vampires very much. They tend to run each other out of their territory. And it leads to people declaring themselves the boss of an area and then sort of pushing everybody else out or subduing everyone around them. And then hoping that if they know how to make vampires, that they're successful enough at it to maintain their power. And if they don't know how to make vampires, that nobody else does, or that they're able to cotton onto it fast enough to stop them if they try. And it becomes a very tense, antisocial situation. Largely, my vampires are people who did not play well with others in life and decided that becoming a monster for the rest of the time seemed like a pretty great way to get off the stage.
Now, so if they're mafia bosses, who are they bossing?
Well, sometimes it's their progeny, sometimes it's the up-and-comers who would like to be the next mafia boss. In the case of Withrow, the title character for the Withrow Chronicles, he was somebody who was tired of getting pushed around. He had never agreed to very much of the demands of his previous boss, but he eventually got tired of even hearing the demands, and so formed a little coalition to knock that guy off, and then said, I'm the new boss, and my rule is I don't tell anybody what the rules are, so go live your life and don't make me come kill you.
Don't tempt me. Okay.
Exactly.
Oh, was that me?
Yes, you're up.
Okay. Well, I have two. I do have the magic vampires, but speaking of biology, much like Clay, I have an entire series of vampires with no magic, period. They are colonial, parasitic, basically intelligent bacteria that split off and infect and basically maintain human bodies. They're, photoallergenic. They have a terrible allergy to cellulose, so anything wooden that gets in their system, like you could theoretically kill my vampires if you stuck them with enough toothpicks because they'd have an allergic reaction. But the common way to kill them was to put a lot of wood into their center mass, which centers around the chest cavity, to get as many of the bacteria dead. You can also kill them with antibiotics, as some of my characters have found.
Ah, okay.
Accidentally. Yes, basically in my universe, the vampires are bacteria, werewolves are a virus, none of them get along, and everyone just wants to get vaccinated, so they don't get either. But they're secret. So basically vampires like to get everyone vaccinated so they can't get the werewolf virus, and the werewolves want everyone to have really good immune systems so they won't become vampires. So, it's a little bit different. They're very social because they're colonial organisms, so they're always trying to actually see each other, but they kind of hate each other too, because like different fragments of the personality have evolved with the human. They kind of read the human like an old VHS tape. They play it back and eventually get almost contaminated by the human that they're with. And every once in a while, the human doesn't die, and that's where the undying comes in, and hence the series is called Rules Undying, if you can guess that happens. I mean, it's not really.
I'm guessing if that's the name of the series, it must happen at least once in a while. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Tina.
My vampires are a split off from my epic fantasy series. I wanted to have vampires created through dragon's blood, a totally different take, where they'd be day-walking vampires. So what you have is that the more powerful your dragon is, then the more powerful your vampire will be. And they're also then linked to their dragon host. So for my series, my Order of the Dragon series, my main character, Leslie, she is suffering from hypothermia in the North Sea, and she's saved by Nessie in dragon form. And so one of the problems that she ends up then having is because she was saved by Nessie, who is a water dragon, is that she can only eat fish blood.
A little bit limiting, yeah, okay.
Yeah, a great play on the entire blood is delicious kind of thing. So you have this character who hates fish even as a human, having to go to the fishmonger, try to find fresh fish. It has to be completely freshly caught.
Gosh. How often are you laughing while you're writing that stuff?
You got to enjoy it while you're doing it, right?
That is correct. Yeah, that is correct. And do they have any specific weaknesses?
Well, because she was a witch before she was actually turned, and trust me, she had no idea what she was doing then either. Her biggest thing is just trying to survive in this new supernatural world. And so once you enter this new world, everyone is after you, be it gods, be it werewolves, be it, fae, everything is just after you. You have a huge target on your back. And so she's just trying to survive as best as she can and figure out what it means to be a fish blood drinking vampire.
To go to Tokyo, go to Tsukiji Fish Market and get like all the live fish.
Oh,
I have her in New York City, so that's they have a good fish market there. But yeah.
Well, yeah, okay. I'm actually getting an idea about something else if we have some extra time at the end, but I digress. In this book, can you guys see it? Blood is the Life, Vampires in Literature. one of the editors, Mary Farr, talks about the fact that she feels as though that by humanizing vampires, that we're actually diminishing their dangerous natures. And I would like to get your reaction to that. Do you agree or disagree? And Jeremy, I want to start with you.
I don't know. I think you have some vampires, like one of the main characters, Eric. He definitely is, he still lives in the human side of himself, and that's causing a lot of his problems. So yeah, he does try to, he's very aware of the monstrous side. So I don't think it works with him. Although, I mean, I don't know. I think the problem is the reader likes him because he's kind of funny, he's honest, and you kind of root for him even when he is wrong, and he often is. But there are still side by side. I mentioned Greta earlier. She doesn't even call humans humans. She called some food. And if she's hungry in the middle of talking to a person, she'll just kill them and eat them because that's what they're for. So, but I do think that if you only have the genteel vampires and you don't show that, then you do kind of rob some of the power of the narrative if you just completely pretend that they're not monsters.
Okay, thank you. Michael.
When somebody says that humanizing vampires makes them less dangerous, my first question is, have they met people? Because I feel like people are pretty wacky. People are pretty dangerous. I've met lots of people who could ultimately be described as monsters. People are manipulative, they're obsessive, they're dangerous, they're predatory, they use each other, they're not nice all the time. And that's true of everybody, including the nice people. It's just one of the facts of being alive. By virtue of being characters that have motivations and things that they need, and things that they need that they ultimately have to take from someone else, they're going to be dangerous no matter what, no matter how human they are. I think actually in some ways making them more human makes them more dangerous. In the Withrow Chronicles, Withrow has a cousin named Roderick who is obviously a homicidal maniac and serial killer, and he's really good at getting along with people and being very social and outgoing, and he does things like go clubbing and hang out in restaurants and things like that because he loves to be that close to his prey. He's exceptionally dangerous. He's way more dangerous in the middle of an Applebee's than he would be if he were like locked in the basement of a barn somewhere trying to hide.
An Applebee, I like that. If I ever go to an Applebee's again, I'm going to think about that. Rachel.
Oh, I'm much of the same boat. I think that there's a whole long storyline of like basically the main vampire that you see in the whole series is so weak and helpless, and it makes you really sympathize, and then it flips around, and when you start finding out more of what they are, it's as soon as you have sympathy for the devil, you let them in. And I'm with him. If you humanize the vampires and you actually dare to get your reader to sympathize, you can just whip around and sucker punch a second later when it goes, at the end of the day, you're still a juice box to this creature, no matter how much you love it. It's like, yes, it's a baby tiger and it's cute and fluffy, but what do baby tigers grow up to be? Mm-hmm. And I think using humanity is the best way to actually heighten the danger, because as soon as you let your guard down, that's when a vampire has you.
Good point. Tina.
I would actually say is there's something great about putting the microscope on how bad humans can be. And so when we're able to actually show the vampires being heroic, it's a safer spot to have that social commentary. So instead of you going and saying, oh, human, you're bad, you're doing, these bad things to society, the vampire can then say, oh, humans, you're bad, you're doing these bad things.
Right.
And so then the reader can actually learn to, in a totally safe space themselves, to appreciate, okay, well, maybe this is something that I can learn. Maybe this is something that I can then, accept in my life or change, or, those are the powers that story actually have. But when we say that there's a monster, simply a monster, I don't think we're actually going deep enough into what monsters are. The biggest monsters are ourselves. And whenever we lie to ourselves and pinpoint or say, well, there's a worse monster from our imagination, we're refusing to deal with our own issues. So.
Okay, well, there's the psychology of monstrous vampires and monstrous humans, right? There we go. Clay.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with everybody. We have a sort of a subclass of vampires in our books who are basically mad dogs. I mean, you can't, they don't talk, they don't bargain, they don't hesitate. And there's something scary about that. It's genuinely frightening, but long term, it's not interesting. There's only so many mad dog attacks you can have in a quartet of novels. So it's, aside from the fact that, yeah, mad dogs are scary, but your creepy neighbor is scary too. Mad dogs are limiting in terms of the stories you can tell about them. So, I mean, I basically agree with everyone else.
Now, how much folklore or, kinds of classic stories, or really more, I guess I'm more interested in the folklore aspect. Did any of you actually use any of that background as, to help inform what the vampires that you created? And Michael, we'll start with you this time.
Really, I leaned into the idea from folklore that lots of different cultures have had myths of vampires or vampire-like things, and they've all had different explanations for how they came about. And so rather than pick one of those and make that my explanation, instead I went with, what if vampires have as many incorrect myths as people do? And so what if vampires are getting it as wrong as anybody else? So I just sort of took a step back from specific myths and said, what if vampires have myths? And they've got all of our myths too, because they used to be us. But they're not the people who made vampires, and they don't really know who did make vampires. And they have legends and stories of that. But ultimately, the oldest vampire that anybody has met is probably 100 years old, because older than that, they just sort of check out of reality. They don't feel like keeping up anymore. So I didn't lean into anything specific, and instead I made the mechanics be something that would just be immediately familiar to modern readers instead of having to explain it a lot. It was just vampires make each other the way that you expect that they make each other.
Right. Okay, Rachel, something's funny. Well, we'll go with you next.
Oh no, I laugh because there's a whole scene in my book where it's like, and this is where baby vampires come from. See, there's a mommy vampire and a daddy vampire, and they do the same thing you do. So stop thinking we bite. It's not like if we bite a friggin' Big Mac, it doesn't turn into a vampire. No, but I actually did a lot of research into King Arthur and Greek mythology, mostly because that's my jam. And the vampires are much the same. They have their own myths, and they're completely confused by them because they're only pieces of the whole. And the old vampires, a lot of them died off. So part of the story is these young vampires trying to figure out what the heck is going on just as much as the humans. And every time they explain it, it's almost like, in Ant-Man, where it's like Michael Phagnix, like, and I knew a guy, and he talked to his cousin, and he talked to his sister, and he talked to them, and they said, so it's played for laughs quite a bit because, I mean, even the vampires think they're ridiculous, but they just keep going on with the best information they can.
Okay. Tina.
I went with a lot of Norse mythology. Everything that I write about fantasy-wise is connected to the Norse pantheon. And so I wanted to find a way of including vampires into their lore. Although you don't specifically have vampires in there, you have something that's closer to a zombie crossed with a dragon in the way that it likes to hoard gold and treasure, which is the drow. I wanted to find a way to have vampires in that as well. And so basically what I did is I was trying to find a way of having another foot soldier for the great war to come, which Norse mythology talks about, of Ragnarok, the end of the gods. So everything is about stopping the end of the gods.
There you go. Clay.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, we used a lot of old folklore and mythology, but because there were certain things that we either didn't want to mess with, or we couldn't find a biological explanation, like turning into bats, or we never quite figured out why garlic, we didn't want to mess with that.
Sulfur compounds, they're very toxic to some creatures.
Well, and the other thing we came up is the reason they don't show up on old photographs is because, or in mirrors, is because old film and mirrors were silver based, and so it would have rejected their image.
Mhm.
But anyway, our point was that we could ignore some folklore that was a little more outlandish, because basically people are stupid and they make up stupid stories over the centuries. So vampires would go, no, we don't do that. I'm not sure where that came from, but if they're afraid of us because of that, that's cool.
We'll go with that. Okay. Yeah.
Oh yeah, always a good one.
Jeremy.
I was a data hoe. I looked at as many different kinds as I could, mainly to see, okay, can I work this in? Is there somebody who, because of their background, would become one of these types of vampire? We have in one of the later books, Anuka Kube shows up, and people are really upset with her because, here's this vampire alongside people who have to drink blood and everything, who, not only can she fly, but she can also walk out in the sun, and she can actually eat food.
Shigaki?
Nukakube.
Mikakube.
They hate her guts. But also like the Vrykolakas, which is, the Greek vampire, which we need a vampire to go talk to these werewolves. It's like, well, all right, I'll go talk to them. Why? Oh, well, they can't decide whether I'm a werewolf or not anyway. And, but like that, so that when you show up, it makes sense either culturally or because and that there were some that I looked at and I was like, wow, somebody had some serious issues as being afraid of women. That's what developed this vampire. But no, it was fun to do all that research.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah. If that's some of what you gleaned from it, I'm sure it was. Now, what are your vampires most afraid of? And let's see, we will start with Rachel this time.
Besides modern medicine, most of them, yeah, honestly, they're afraid of the grasshopper and the ant. They're afraid that there are very few of them, and if all the humans figured out what the vampires were, and that, they're not magical, they're stronger, they're faster, they have certain abilities, most of which are unrepeatable because they involve certain bodily fluids. Which people who are at last Dragon Con know the infamous reveal of that. But they're afraid that if they're discovered, all it really takes is someone with a tanning booth, some tetracycline, and a death wish, and they're going to be wiped out. And so they have lots of rules and try to control people and stay in the shadows, and are pretty much all neurotic because of it.
Okay. Tina.
I was really thinking hard about this. For most of my vampires, because they're part of this elite force, they don't know freedom. They've always had to follow someone else's order. They've always had to fall in line. And so if they've ever had to actually be free and make their own decisions, I don't know what they do. I think we'd have a lot of mutiny, a whole lot of fun going on, bloodshed. All of those things that we'd probably write about. But yeah, I definitely think freedom without having someone to tell them what to do. If they had to make up their own minds, I don't know what they do.
Interesting. Okay. Clay.
That's what our vampires were most afraid of, actually, was ingenuity.
Oh,
The basic premise is that in the late 1800s, vampires were smart enough to realize that human productive capacity with the Industrial Revolution was growing exponentially, and soon humans would have easily the firepower to destroy them. So they knew they had to act and put the brakes on that before humans could build enough weapons that they would no longer fear the darkness. So they rose up and destroyed the industrial world of the North. So they were basically afraid that humans were building things because although they're resistant to pain, they can die. You can tear them to pieces. And when in the quartet, when the war finally does start, in many ways, the humans have the advantage because the destructive capacity of, say, a World War I era army is enormous. And vampires who are limited in their organization can't stand up to it.
Thank you. Jeremy?
I think it's kind of not any one thing for vampires as a whole. I think the more organized vampires are afraid of kind of, disorder of the system that they have to protect themselves and keep themselves in power breaking down, but also of Lord Phil, one of the creepiest vampires in the books. He's more afraid of boredom, so he cautions Eric, no. I engineered this special dish so you'll actually be able to eat something, but I've had the chef burn it a little. Because if it's perfect, then you can never exceed it. And you always want to be able to make an experience a little bit better. So you engineer flaws into it. So I think his is the most interesting fear, I think. And, setting out to try to make sure that you only take half steps towards perfection so that there's always still room to have more fun another time.
Okay. Well, there might be a little bit of a life lesson there, right? Michael?
I think that mine are most afraid of the concept of future shock. There's a really fascinating book written in the 60s by a guy named Alvin Toffler and his wife Adelaide. And the premise of it, it's a nonfiction book. The premise of it is called Future Shock. The premise is the average person grows up learning how to cope with the world as it operates at a specific pace, technological level, access to news, access to information, things like that. And then by the time they are an adult, the world has accelerated all of those things and they are no longer capable of coping with the new pace of change, information, etc. And his premise was basically that's what shaped America's domestic social scene for the vast majority of the 20th century. And things like claims of, silent majorities that support the way it used to be and things like that are basically people leaning into that idea and saying, I can't cope with what's happening right now. Surely no one else can either. And so I think they basically have really fallen victim to that, and they all know it's happening to them. And they all know that eventually there's going to be a night when they wake up and they don't have any way to gain a way in to society anymore. It's not just that they go to the club and they don't recognize the music, it's that they don't recognize anything. They turn on TV and it's an alien planet. And so for them, that's what's ultimately the most terrifying thing. They'll phrase it in more practical ways, and they'll usually frame it as they're afraid of being discovered. But really what they're afraid of is being discovered by a humanity that they don't feel they can persuade anymore.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a very interesting set of fears, and not phobias, but actual, real fears. Who are some of your favorite literary vampires that appear in books of any kind, whether it's contemporary fiction or if it's the more classic approaches? And Tina, we'll start with you again. We're back at the beginning.
Oh my gosh, there's so many. I really enjoyed Charlene Harris's series, the Sookie Stackhouse series. My favorite was Eric. There's just something great about a Viking who's all powerful, and it's just wow. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. That's fine.
No one's arguing, Tina. No one.
We're right there with you.
Yeah.
And I have to admit this, once, spoiler alert, once he got together with Sookie, that's where the series ended for me. I could not read on. I did not finish the rest of it. That was the perfect ending for me, no matter what else happened. But I also enjoyed Twilight, for instance. And I think if I could become a vampire, I want to live in the Twilight version of vampires, because they're not as dangerous. They're cool kids in high school forever. So that could be
Yeah.
heaven or hell. So definitely, and Chloe Neal, she has the Chicagoland Vampire series. I absolutely adore that one. Okay, and Janine Frost, one more. Janine Frost. Cat and Bones, I love those as well. I have a whole list. I love vampire books. So.
Okay, thank you. Clay.
Well, I'm a Dracula guy, as was mentioned earlier. I mean, that's a formative book for me, probably the formative book for me. I read it when I was like Michael, 12, 13 years old. Didn't quite get that I was reading about fear of foreigners and fear of sexual perversion, but wonderful delight in sexual perversion that the Victorians had. Didn't figure that out till a little bit later. But my favorite version of Dracula, there's a lot of movie versions that are really good, but I think my favorite version of Dracula is actually the Tomb of Dracula comic book that Marvel put out back in the 70s with Marv Wolfman and Gene Cole and Tom Palmer. Pretty much all three of those guys for the entire 75 issue run, except for a few issues at the beginning. It's spectacular. It's an amazing achievement in comic book history. And it's a really good version of Dracula. It's where Blade the Vampire Slayer comes from. But I'm a Dracula dude, so pretty simple.
Okay, well, there you go. Now, see, you need a shirt that says Dracula, dude.
Right?
Give Susan that idea for your next one.
No, she's not good.
Yeah. Jeremy.
I'm definitely with Clay on Tomb of Dracula, although one of my favorite moments with Marvel's Dracula is from, of all things, an X-Men annual where Wolverine holds up single claws to make a cross and tries to drive Dracula back, and he says, "You have to believe, little man," and sends him flying across sends him flying across the battlefield, and Nightcrawler pops up with 2 twigs and says, "Oh, well then back." And then suddenly Dracula has to flee because Nightcrawler, diehard religious. But aside from that, also on Dracula, if you have read it and didn't get it, or was like, one of the best ways to read Dracula for me is Les Klinger's annotated Dracula series collection. It's just wonderful. And like a lot of annotated books I think should do, his is all written with the caveat that it's real, it happened, and any inconsistencies were obviously purposeful. And there's a lot of debate on who did that. Did Dracula edit the text to conceal the real location of Castle Dracula? Or did Mina edit the text to protect Jonathan's, let's say, manhood or reputation? And it's really interesting. So yeah, definitely Dracula in all his various forms. And of course, the world of Buffy, where Spike is my man.
Okay. Michael.
I'm another Dracula dude. Like, sign me up for that T-shirt. Let me know when you put the order in.
Yeah.
And I love Dracula partly because like there are a lot of problems with it, and it has to be read very critically for the reasons that you talked about, Clay. And it also, in some ways, like as a 7th grader, I read it as being this weirdly sort of proto-feminist text, and later read that Stoker like kind of wanted to incorporate some of those concepts himself, while he incorporated a lot of weird xenophobia. But these days, I think my favorite like current incarnation of vampires is probably Pat Elrod's, P.N. Elrod's. She has a series called The Vampire Files, and they are about a guy who was a muckraker journalist in gangland Chicago who got knocked off for asking the wrong question and becomes a vampire and decides to take revenge on the mob in gangland Chicago. And it's so much fun. And she like dials back the monster side until it's really useful and then dials it way up. And the rest of the time it's kind of a tragic detective, hard-boiled detective series that is just really beautiful. I really love it.
Great. Okay, Rachel.
Well, it's going to sound really disingenuous because I found this book called Bill the Vampire, which was an incredibly like lowbrow comedy version of vampires, which led me to Fred the Vampire and a lot of other boring named vampires. But I loved the series so much, I pretty much hounded the guy who created it until he allowed his universe to open up, and then I got to write a book in that universe, and now I have a series there. So that was totally me chasing my comedic vampires. But I have to give a shout out to Spike, because maybe it's just the age I am, but Angel and Spike were the vampires. I mean, Interview with the Vampire is great. There's a lot of great vampire fiction, but we all watched Buffy religiously, and James Marsters stole my heart. So I just had to say it.
There you go. Well, that leads in, a couple of you have mentioned Spike and, well, you had said Spike and Angel. So my next question does revolve around what TV or film versions of vampires have you most enjoyed? You know, it could be throughout your lifetime or even in the last 10 years or so. And Clay, we'll start with you.
Well, just to mention Spike, I personally was not a big Buffy guy. My wife was a big Buffy person, but James Marsters did do our audiobooks.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
And he's incredible. I mean, he does the Butcher books as well.
Yeah.
Man, he's great. And my wife will never forgive me because one day he actually called the house to ask a question about something, and I answered the phone and talked to him and didn't think to say, oh, James Marsters on the phone, pick up the line. So I hung up.
Grounds for divorce.
I said, oh, it was Marsters. He was calling to ask about a voice of one of the characters. And it was like, are you effing kidding me? So anyway, Spike aside, who almost ruined our marriage.
You're right, Rachel.
He probably ruined a lot of people's marriages. I go back actually to the original Night Stalker TV movie that they made, the Kolchak, the Night Stalker TV show, and it was a vampire story. The vampire was a supporting character, but it was a really important transitional version of a vampire. He still wore a cape and a nice suit like Dracula, but he was a different kind of creepy night stalker-y guy preying on prostitutes in Las Vegas. I thought a really interesting transition from, you could tell a vampire because he was wearing a cape in the early 20th century, to a different kind of predator vampire. And I put it there at Night Stalker, but that's just me.
Okay, Jeremy. Well, you mentioned Spike. Who? Anybody else?
Yeah, Spike and Angel aside, I think one of the most interesting ones that I go back to is, I think the name of the movie is The Hunger with David Bowie, and I just love the tragicness of, here is this vampire, and as she goes through the ages, she falls in love. She changes her love into a vampire, knowing that they're not going to be a full vampire like she is, and so they're going to degrade and decay, but they won't ever die. And so we have this, I think it's kind of like almost a warehouse or a mausoleum, I forget now, it's been a while since I rewatched it, of all her old lovers that she visits every now and then. Some of them can't hear her anymore, but she should check in on them because she does love them, all 100 or whatever of them there are in that warehouse.
It's the attic of the building she lives in.
Ah, thank you.
Still creepy, no matter how you look at it, yes. Michael.
Who among us hasn't trapped a few dozen ex-lovers in their houses at one point or another? You know?
Guilty. No, not really.
I don't know. Maybe that's, I don't know. I don't understand straight culture, so I'm assuming all of you do the same thing. Gosh, I don't know. Favorite one on film. Okay, so while we're on Buffy, Drusilla. Drusilla is clearly the best vampire in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. She is living her best life, and she does not care what happens to anybody else. That's living the dream right there. Otherwise, I'm going to say Christopher Lee, great Dracula, love him as Dracula. I'm also going to say Bela Lugosi as Dracula because that movie does such a great job of depicting the way in which Dracula is this like anachronism. There's a scene in the original movie where Mina and Lucy, immediately after seeing Dracula at the opera for the first time, or the theater, they are back at their place and they're just mercilessly making fun of the cape because it's already a joke. Look, like by the time that they're showing it, the first time you see Dracula dressed in an opera cape, it's a joke. And so I think that's a genius portrayal, and I think Bela Lugosi was amazing. I think I'll stop there.
Okay. Bela Lugosi's probably a good one to do that. Rachel.
Well, I'll go obscure and Canadian because I happen to be a big fan of Forever Night, which was a TV movie and then a Canadian TV series that was on in syndication very late when I was a teenager. And I loved the thought of the vampire who wants to do good, who works nights, obviously, as a cop. And it was just, there was a certain earnestness to it that I think influenced a lot of what I write today. I also love Being Human for the same thing, more so the BBC, because I haven't seen the American one as much on Sci-Fi. But I just love vampires in boring situations. Like, how they deal with stuff makes me happy. It's my jam.
I love that. Vampires in boring situations. Now, that's an idea. There you go.
That's my whole series, just summed up.
Well, you're living your best life, too, just like Drusilla, right? Mm-hmm. Tina.
I totally have a thing for vampires in leather, so I'm going to go with Underworld.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I totally love that. If it comes on, I have to watch it. But then there's also Dracula with Gerard Butler. I thought that was a great version of it. As well as Vampires with James Woods. That was the only vampire movie that actually made me cry. I'm crying. I sobbed in the theater about it. My husband was like, why are you crying? I'm just like, oh, this is just so heart-wrenching. But of course, From Dusk Till Dawn, can't forget that one. The action, the Tarantino vibe, it's just perfect.
Great. Well, now, kind of as a final thought, I have this quote from this book here, Our Vampires Ourselves. I don't know if you guys can see it. I'm trying to, oh, there we go. That works. It looks a little creepy, by Nina Auerbach. And she says, if vampires are a reflection of the times they are created, they will likely always be around. And I just really quickly, do you agree or disagree with that? I mean, look how long we've had them already. Let's see, where did I leave off? Jeremy, you're a, or anybody. Yeah, I mean, do you agree with that they will always be here if they are a reflection of their...
Yeah, I think vampires, werewolves, zombies, there's some mythos that they just tie into something that's key in man, and we're going to reinvent them over and over again as long as we're telling stories.
Yeah. Margot Adler wrote a terrific I can't remember the name of it now, a terrific little novelette about nonfiction about vampires, in which she claims that each era has its own reason for vampires, whether it's a reaction to sexual repression, whether it's a reaction to foreign invasion. She claims that vampires in the 20th century are primarily a way to understand the use and misuse of power, which I believe.
Yeah.
But I wish I could remember the name of it. She's the one who wrote Drawing Down the Moon, so about modern witchcraft. But she wrote a short thing.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But yes, I agree with that.
Anybody else want to chime in? Any thoughts on that?
I feel like we're interested in historical fiction because we like to look back on another time period and wonder what it would be like to be there. And vampires very tidily turn that sock inside out and say, what if that era came here?
Yeah.
And what if that era were super dangerous and I could become a part of it? And I feel like that's a really heady combination of things, that fascination with the anachronism, but also that question of like, you could end up becoming the monster, and would that be so bad? And I think every era has reason to ask themselves that question.
I mean, there's sex and power, which are two things that are fundamental to humanity. So as long as those matter to us, I think vampires are always going to come back.
As well as a safe way to, once again, give that social commentary without, hitting it right on the nose.
The answer that's the same.
Yes.
Right. Yes, that makes sense. Well, I want to thank all of you so much for being here tonight. I appreciate it so much. I'm sorry that I'm not getting to see any of you actually in person. We will think positive for 2021, but I do hope that you have enjoyed the things that you've done so far this year for virtual Dragon Con. And again, thank you. And I will give you a hand myself since we don't have an in-person audience to do it. And again, thank you so much. Thanks to our viewers, anybody who will be watching this during Dragon Con weekend or from now until, well, as long as YouTube and Facebook last. So thanks very much, you guys. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Thanks, Carol.
Oh, that's not what I meant to do.
Wave again.